here to talk about your novel, Men of Winter.
Mm-hmm.
This is a kind of an interesting piece. It's part, original novel, part revisionist fiction, part sequel of sorts.
Yeah, of sorts, right. Yeah, it's got a lot of different things going on in it. Obviously inspired on some level by Homer's Odyssey,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of masked in a way that I think a lot of readers who read it don't necessarily even pick up on that, but that's okay, because I try to write it in such a way that you might maybe get more out of it if you understood sort of the Homer, Odyssey, Iliad background, but on the other hand, it wouldn't be necessary to reading it and hopefully enjoying the storyline nevertheless.
Yeah. The title itself comes from book. I'm losing it. Some book from Homer's
Book
Odyssey.
11. Book 11. Yeah, which is Odysseus' trip to the underworld,
Mm-hmm.
and it's specifically from the Robert Fitzgerald translation. Of course, Fitzgerald's a Springfield native, so I always like to give him a plug on that. But yeah, Men of Winter refers to, or is from the beginning of Book 11, and actually there's some controversy or some disagreement at least about what the phrase even means, and I've always taken it to mean as kind of a metaphor for the dead, Men of Winter, and that's how I'm sort of using it. But again, I've heard other people have different opinions as to what Homer may have meant by it, and like I said, in other translations it doesn't come out quite as Men of Winter anyway. So, but that's I took it from Fitzgerald, and that's how I'm using it anyway. So,
okay, how does that play out in the book? I mean, how does this your interpretation where Men of Winter is a reference to the dead?
Well, it's as you know, it's set during a war,
Mm-hmm.
and even though it's a fictionalized setting, and I don't ever deliberately pin down the physical setting and the time frame. The hint is that it's early 20th century, probably Russia, maybe specifically Siberia, a World War I-like war, but again, not specifically World War I. And so the environment is this cold, wintry environment, and then you have all the soldiers who are participating in this long-standing war, and obviously there's going to be lots of dead in a war, and so that kind of plays into it as well. These Men of Winter are these soldiers who are stuck, for years at a time, on this front line of this war. But that's sort of in the background of the story, and really the main focus is this journalist Hector Pastrovich, who travels to the front, actually for sort of various reasons, some seemingly noble and some not so noble, and then it's really following his kind of odyssey, from his hometown to the front, and then the various things that happen to him there. But yeah, the Men of Winter specifically tends to reference the soldiers who are stuck in this long-standing war.
Hector, he's at the front. He is called out ostensibly to cover the war. You say for his own purposes. He's pursuing a character, the Prince of Ithaca.
Right.
Not necessarily an actual prince here, just interesting, charismatic, possibly crazy man he finds in the drunk tank early on.
Right.
And although we only see this character very early on and very briefly, he seems to play a really large role in the story at large. It seems that everything Hector does is in pursuit of this man's story. What can you tell us about this character?
Well, yeah, it is one of the features of the novel, as you say, where Hector meets him, and he seems to then become a vehicle for Hector to pursue this other line of writing, which he's been kind of pressured into doing for a rival newspaper that does more what we would call tabloid style newspaper stories. And so when he meets this crazy Prince of Ithaca character, he thinks he must have a really interesting and hopefully sort of sordid background, and perhaps if he pursues him and the story, that will lend itself to writing something for this less journalistically proper paper, and leading to more money and maybe more fame and those kinds of things. So he on the one hand is covering the war in an ethical sense, but really his main motivation is to hopefully pursue this Prince of Ithaca character, and hopefully that will lead to something like I said, more interesting and more lucrative in the long run. Right.
Again, not necessarily a prince.
Right.
He's referred to as the Prince of Ithaca.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Well, again, of course, it goes back to that whole Homeric, starting point. Of course, Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey is he's the king of Ithaca, and he's trying to get back home after the Trojan War, and I chose the idea of the Prince of Ithaca as opposed to the King of Ithaca because everything in the novel isn't quite right. As I said earlier, the setting is hinted at and the time period is hinted at, but never quite pinned down. And I really wanted the whole novel to have this sort of, this sort of feel as if you're maybe looking at it through a kind of wavy, old-fashioned window or something, where the images are there, but they're not perfectly clear, and leaving some room for interpretation. And so everything I put into the novel, again, is just a little bit off kilter, and so that's why I wanted to name a character Prince of Ithaca as obviously a nod back to Homer, but on the other hand, not a very clear-cut nod. So it isn't adding up perfectly for the reader.
And I'm finding that as I read the book, I guess I went in knowing that there was this connection to Homer's Odyssey, and just sort of half expecting, what do you say, almost a one-to-one correlation of character to character, setting to setting, situation to situation, and we don't necessarily quite see that. Elements of your story evoke elements of the Odyssey, but not, what do we say? It's not a direct translation or a direct conversion.
Sure.
Helena.
Right.
While the Prince of Ithaca is like the, what do we say, the driving force behind the story, we meet this character early on, and Hector is pursuing his story through the remainder of your novel. The story seems to kind of revolve around this character, Helena, that Hector meets along the way, meets on the train ride out to the front, and she seems to have some connection potentially to the Prince of Ithaca, but what can you tell us about her? Right.
Well, yeah, she's one of the characters that we meet in the very first chapter, and then she disappears for a while and comes back a little later. But as you and I have talked on other occasions, the Prince of Ithaca seems to have connection with all sorts of characters in the book, to the point where one begins to wonder, I suppose, if it's even a real person or if it's some sort of manifestation of different people's imaginations or whatever. But yeah, she's going to the front, which is an unlikely place for a single, traveling by herself woman to be going anyway. And it's not quite clear why she's going there. Then ultimately, the hint is that she's looking for a man, and then there seems to be this possibility that she's pursuing the same person that Hector is, but for different reasons. But again, nothing is ever quite clear, deliberately so. And yeah, in terms of direct references to the Odyssey, there are some. But at the same time, I didn't want it to be almost like a code for the Odyssey, where there's like this allegorical connection to this versus that, and in some cases I actually kind of do these hybrid, because even though the Odyssey is the main sort of allusion that I go for more often than not, even Homer's Iliad plays a part in my thought process as I was putting it together. Obviously, the main character Hector is named after, in a sense, Hector, the Trojan, commander in the Iliad, and a fact that's referenced even in the first chapter of the novel. And then there are other references. In fact, the whole idea of this story taking place in the foreground with this long-standing war in the background is really a Homeric Iliad thing too, because a lot of people who either haven't read the Iliad or it's been 25 years since they've read it, they sort of think of it as being a poem about the Trojan War, but in fact it's really about this conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon, and the war is just really in the background. I mean, it provides some subtext, and obviously it influences the plot and characterization to some degree, but it really takes place during a fairly small period of time during the 9th year of the Trojan War. And again, my novel is set in the 9th year of this long-standing war, and so that's really more of a nod to the Iliad than the Odyssey per se. And there are a few little things throughout the book that are, either directly related to the Iliad, or they're kind of this hybrid Iliad-Odyssey thing going on.
believe in your fictional setting, Iloskova.
Right.
This is a reference to the Iliad, essentially. Iliad.
Yeah, well, I changed the name of that darn city a lot of times. I don't even remember what all of the different manifestations were, but it took me a while to figure out something. I do pepper the novel with some actual Russian place names, just again to sort of fortify someone's belief that this is taking place in Russia. But at the same time, I didn't want to pin it down to a specific Russian city. I wanted to make up my own place, and so I came up with this Iloskova, and yeah, part of my thinking was, well, there's something about the name that sort of evokes the Iliad, and I suppose there's something about that evokes Illinois too, for that matter, But and it gave me a chance to come up with sort of this bizarre spelling, which I know has really no connection to Russian spelling whatsoever, but yeah, there was a lot of thought that went into that, and that's what I eventually came up with. Excuse me.
Why Russia? This is kind of a reference to the Iliad, reference to the Odyssey. Both kind of revolving around the Trojan War. Mm-hmm. How did you pick a Russian or Siberian setting for your story?
Right. Well, excuse me. As you and I have talked on earlier occasions, I had actually written a story right before I started working on this, which was a definite sequel to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein ends in Siberia, close to the North Pole, that kind of thing. And so for my short story that I wrote called A Wintering Place, that's a definite sequel to Frankenstein, I set it in this kind of Russian environment just because it was logical for a sequel to Frankenstein. And so I'd worked with it, and I really enjoyed just the feel of it and some of the opportunities for metaphor in terms of using winter and the cold and desolation and darkness and all those kinds of things. So my mind was still very much kind of working in those ideas when I got started thinking about this particular story, which actually I wanted to be another short story. I really thought, well, I could write another short story because I enjoyed, and thought that the Frankenstein thing came out fairly well, and I enjoyed writing it. So I thought, well, I'll write another short story, kind of somehow tied loosely to Homer's Odyssey, and I'll go ahead and play with this idea of it being in Russia, just again because I was already in the zone, so to speak. And then, of course, it ended up becoming a full-blown novel. But that's really kind of how I got started on that, just because it was kind of a carryover from this other thinking that I was doing on this other story. But once I got into it, I really, again, enjoyed the metaphorical possibilities, and it just seemed to lend itself, again, to the sort of mood of bleakness that I had in mind for this novel.
The war in this story.
Mm-hmm.
Also, just kind of a pervasive element, always in the background. Just as with the Iliad, it's always in the background, not necessarily the focus, but it's something that we are constantly aware of throughout your novel,
mm-hmm.
And we don't see it until fairly briefly in the final chapters. And I'm kind of interested. It strikes me that the war is something of a foil to the Prince of Ithaca, who also is this kind of pervasive element or entity or something that we're constantly aware of throughout the book, but who only makes a very brief appearance in the beginning chapters of the novel.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a relationship between the Prince of Ithaca and the war at the front?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's all sort of hinted at, but and not necessarily spelled out directly, but there seems to be this connection in terms of who the prince is or where he may come from, and he seems to have this sort of maybe warrior nature, or at least someone who's constantly, on the verge of violence, either causing it himself or being the victim of it. And so there just seems to be this sort of magnetic attraction between that particular character and the war itself, which of course is one of the reasons why Hector thinks that maybe if he goes to the front, he'll find out more about this character and maybe even find him himself, just because he seems like, given his mental state, that he must have come from someplace like this war zone in order to be kind of as crazy as he is. And that's the other thing about this Iloskova that I've created. I've wanted it to be this almost like a kind of open air loony bin. I mean, and again, because of the war and the shortages and the constant cold, and just how that would wear on a citizenry, year upon year upon year. And so, yeah, I think there is a connection between Prince of Ithaca and the war, but again, not necessarily a direct one, and not one that the main character knows for sure. He's just kind of following his hunch that there may be this connection.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, clearly is a magnetic character. We get the impression that Hector is, although he's called upon to go out to the front to cover the war, covering the war is not his motivation in going out to the front.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to find out more about this Prince of Ithaca character, and he's apparently so interested in the Prince of Ithaca that he's willing to brave this war zone.
Mm-hmm.
Just to learn more about this man he's met once early on in the story.
Right, right. Well, yeah, and of course, Hector has been encouraged by his good editor to do this for apparently some time. We don't really know how long, but it's been something that he's been encouraged to do, for legitimate journalistic purposes. And he has those ambiguous and sort of competing feelings as he goes there, because on the one hand, yes, his main motivation is to track down hopefully this strange Prince of Ithaca, and hopefully that will lead to some sort of sensational story that he can write and make all kinds of money off of. But at the same time, he does have this other part of him that wants to be sort of true to his good editor and do a legitimate job, and he sort of bounces back and forth between doing the right thing, which is legitimately covering the war as a ethical journalist, and then this other thing which he knows could possibly net him more money and a bigger reputation and those kinds of things. So he never really quite completely goes over to the dark side, but it's always kind of this tug of war, no pun intended, in his psyche as to what his motivation is and which direction he's going to choose as he encounters various elements along the way.
Some of your viewers have compared your writing style to some of the better-known Russian writers.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is set in Siberia. Is this a personal interest of yours? Are you, what do we say, an aficionado or a fan of the Russian?
Well, yes, but ironically, I hadn't really read that much. I mean, Tolstoy is the name that was thrown out there, but I think it's largely just the fact it's set in this Russian-like environment. I think that's where the comparisons begin and pretty much end. But at the time, I hadn't read a lot of Russian writers. I had that interest, but it just wasn't something I'd managed to get through a lot of material of. But since then, since writing the novel and so forth, I've actually read a lot of Russian literature. In fact, I finally made my way through War and Peace last year for the first time. But so there was definitely an interest, and I had read a few things. And I think I definitely drew on the few things that I had read in terms of trying to get the tone right and just some of the elements and so forth. I mean, I did do some research, even though I wasn't specifically trying to set it in a real Russian place. I definitely did some reading, and I drew from both fiction and nonfiction sources just to try to get the feel and some of the terminology correct and those kinds of things. So I really I'm obviously flattered if someone wants to compare it to Tolstoy or something, but I think it's probably more the setting than anything. But since then I've really read quite a bit of not just Tolstoy but Dostoevsky and Gogol and Chekhov and so now if I were to write the novel, I'd probably be able to do a much better job because I have a lot more material that I've read in the meantime.
Okay. What's your interest in? I mean, you've written this Wintering Place,
mm-hmm.
which is a sort of a revisionist sequel to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein,
mm-hmm.
and now Men of Winter, which is sort of a revisionist sequel to the Odyssey, the Iliad. This is an interest of yours, clearly?
Well, yeah, no, the whole winter thing, you're talking about the metaphor of winter or the revisionist.
Well, I'm actually
Okay.
curious about your seeming pattern of writing revisionist fiction.
Right. Well, okay, yeah, part of it is because reading revisionist fiction. I just read a lot that I really enjoyed. Just a few examples. One of my favorites is J.M. Coetzee, the South African author. His novel Foe, which is a retelling of Robinson Crusoe plus several other Defoe novels kind of tossed in the mix there. And then Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea, which is a retelling, actually kind of a prequel of Jane Eyre, and others of that ilk. And I really enjoyed them, and so that kind of got me thinking about other stories that maybe I could use as a jumping off point in terms of characters or even the plot or what have you. And that's really what got me sort of thinking about it. And then once I did some, I enjoyed it. It's kind of the best of both worlds, because on the one hand you get to be creative and enjoy that part of the writing, but at the same time you're able to justify spending a lot of quality time with books you already love, and so you have a really good reason to go back and read Frankenstein really carefully, or to read Homer again, or what have you. And so it kind of appeals, I guess, to my literary interests, but also my writing interests as well. I did go through a few episodes like that. I did, obviously, Men of Winter. I mentioned the Mary Shelley short story sequel to Frankenstein, and I do have a book coming out, as you know, this year, Weeping with an Ancient God, which is a sort of a fictional biography of Melville and his time with cannibals, when he was a young man, a sailor. Since then, though, I have kind of gotten away from it. So I've got these several things that are coming out, which are definitely revisionist, but the most recent work that I've done has not been revisionist per se, and it's not necessarily because I got tired of doing it. I just got other ideas about things. But yeah, I know I've compared it at times to the revisionist idea of I'm not a musician, but I think it may be a little bit like a musician doing a cover of like a song that they love, not because they think they can do it better, or they think that the original artist, somehow dropped the ball, but just they really love the original and they want to kind of see if they can, pay homage to it, but also maybe put their own kind of spin on it as well. Now, I think it's a little bit like that too. I really, really respect the original and enjoy working, off of it, but not because I feel like I can somehow improve on Homer or whatever. But it's just a kind of a fun exercise to get involved in.
Sure. Weeping with an Ancient God. That's this is a novella coming out. And I believe you said earlier that Men of Winter had kind of started as, more of a short story along the lines of a wintering place, and sort of expanded into the novel that it is now.
Right.
How'd that happen?
Well, I guess I'm really awful at figuring out how long something's going to be, because, I wrote, like I said, the short story, and it ended up being a really short story. I forget the length, but let's say 3,000 words-ish. And so when I started down this path, I thought it was going to be sort of a similar length, Men of Winter. But like I said, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger instead of smaller. And with Weeping with an Ancient God, I really started off wanting to write a full-blown novel, and then I ended up kind of curtailing it and not quite getting there in terms of length. It's 30-some thousand words or whatever. And so I just really don't know. I have a very organic writing process. I know that there are some writers who will do very detailed outlines, and they kind of draw themselves a map of their entire work before they ever start writing. Actually, my mentor, or one of my first mentors, Kent Hariff, he was my thesis director down at Carbondale, and he's like that. He maps out all of his books, and every chapter has a specific game plan for what it's going to accomplish in the narrative, and he just systematically works his way through it. I just really, really admire that. And for a while I tried to do that myself, and it just did not work. I just could not follow that game plan at all. And so I'm much more just kind of get the momentum started, and then just sort of let it go where it goes. And even now, I finished a new novel last summer, which ended up being pretty long. It's over 400 pages of manuscript, and so I deliberately decided, well, I'm going to take a few months and just write some short stories and that kind of thing. And I did manage to write, I think, 3 actual legitimate short stories. But then I was working on one this spring, which I wanted to be another short story, and it ended up being a long short story. It's like, you know, almost 40 pages, which is going to be really difficult to find a place to publish because it's so long, but yet it's not even a novella really in terms of length. And so yeah, my process is organic. I really don't know quite what it's going to become. Usually I get to sort of what ends up becoming a sort of midway point, and I do kind of get a feel, okay, I'm now about halfway roughly through whatever it is I'm writing, and so if I'm on page 4 of a manuscript and I reach the halfway point, I can kind of breathe a sigh of relief and realize, okay, this is going to be a short story. But if I'm on page 110 and I'm reaching that midway point and I realize, oh, okay, obviously this is going to be a full-blown novel. And you know, again, I get there's kind of those two schools out there. You know, I'll hear writers who are very good about the mapping things out, and then I'll hear of other writers who are more like me, who kind of have to feel their way in the dark to figure out where they're going.